Hey everyone, welcome to InterviewPro. In this video, let's see how to manage state without using useStateHook. React provides another hook called useReducer, which is an alternative to useState. It helps to manage complex state logic. UseReducer hook accepts a reducer function and the initial state as parameter. It returns an array of current state value and a dispatch function. Let's see how this can be used in the users component. This is the same example that we were using from the beginning. I made a few changes here. I have added a checkbox that tells us if the user is admin or not. Also, if we click on add user, let's say with user 4 and click on add user, the user will be added to the list. Let me show the code as well. To the users array, I have added another property isAdmin, which is false for all the users initially. This is the checkbox which tells us whether the user is admin or not. When we click on the checkbox, on admin check change function will be called. This will set admin isAdmin property to true or false based on the checkbox value. Previously, we didn't had any functionality for add user. Now I have updated the code. I'm checking if the user is already existing or not. If the user is not existing, I am adding the user to this new users list array and finally updating the user state. Now let's see how to use useReducer hook instead of useState. So let me just uncomment this and import useReducer hook. This is available in the React library. And the initial state is we have two different states, users and is loading. So let me move the state to this useReducer. So initially users will be empty array and is loading will be true. Now we don't need these two states. When the component is loaded, the state will be set to this initial object. To update the state, we emit actions using dispatch function. Reducer is a function that will update the state based on the action that is dispatched. First, let's define this reducer function. This can be defined outside your component. So const reducer, this is a function. This function is going to take two parameters, one the state and the other is the action. This action can be a string or an object. In our case, I'll take object so that we can specify what is the type of action that is dispatched, and if we want to pass any data, we can specify the payload as well. So my action object is going to look like this: type, which holds the type of action that is dispatched, and payload, which contains the data. We will have multiple actions. For example, in the use effect, we are loading the users and also we are setting the value for is loading. Then we have add user, which would update the users list with the newly added user. Then we have on admin check change, which would update the is admin status of a particular user. So all these functions are nothing but actions. To maintain all these actions, I'll be using the switch case. Switch action dot type. So I have different actions. For example, users. That means to load the users. I can say users or I can say load users as well. Load underscore users. Then we have another case to set the is loading. So I'll simply say loading. Then we have another case to add user, add underscore user. Then we have another case to update the admin status, right? So I'll simply say toggle admin. In the default case, when the type doesn't match with none of these states, we'll simply throw an error. Throw new error, invalid type, and let's specify the type as well, action dot type. Let's define these actions one by one. In the load users, we are going to update the user's state with this constant array, users array that we have here. So here, remember in each of these cases, we are not going to mutate the state. The state is going to remain the same. We will simply create a new state and return, so that when this action is dispatched, we'll return a new state, and this state object will be updated with the new state object. Return, what is our state? Our previous state. In the previous state, I just want to update the users array. So users colon, I'll update with the users array constant. Then we have loading. Here we are just updating the loading to true or false. Whether to set this loading to true or false is based on the parameter that we sent. So I'll be passing a payload. Assuming there is a payload, what we will do is the state users object is going to remain the same. The only thing that is going to change is loading, that will be set to the value sent in the payload. So action dot payload. Then we have add user. This is going to be this logic. So first we will be reading the value present in the input. Then we'll send this logic to the dispatch. So let me just cut it from here and paste it here. So new user is nothing but the action dot payload. I'll be sending this information in the form of payload. So action dot payload. If the payload value is empty, then we'll simply return it. We don't need to process this information because there is no user to add. Then we have users. This users is nothing but state.users. Also this new user, or so this new user will be coming from the payload. So let me create a constant new user equal to action.payload. If this payload value is empty or null or undefined, we'll simply return because there is no user to add. If the payload is not empty and it has some data, then we'll try to add that user. So in the users, in this case, it's state.users. We'll find the maximum ID because every user needs to have an ID, right? So we'll find what is the maximum ID that we have so far in the users array, and we'll see if this user is already existing or not. First, this is state.users. Then this is new user, which is action.payload. If this user is not present, then the index would be -1 using find index. So in such case, we'll create a new user list because we do not want to update or mutate the original state. So we'll simply use the spread operator to get the contents of the user's state. Then we'll add the new user. So I'm adding max ID +1. Max ID is the one which we got from the existing users. And the name is nothing but payload. Instead of using set users here, we'll say return state, and the users will be updated with new user list. If the user is already present, we'll simply return the original state without any modifications. Here also just return original state. Then we have toggle admin. What are we doing in the toggle admin? We are receiving the event information, and based on the event the target.checked, we are getting the value whether the checkbox is checked or not. Then we are storing the users array in the updated users constant. Then in this updated users, we are trying to find the user with the given ID. And if the user is found, then we are updating the isAdmin property of that user with the event.target.checked value. Finally, we are updating the user state with this updated users. Now we'll move this entire code to toggle admin. So this is going to be state.users, and the ID is coming from the payload. So I'll create a constant ID action dot payload. Then the remaining code is going to be the same, and here we'll simply return the old state, comma, users is now updated with updated users. So this is our reducer function. Let's try to dispatch these actions. In the use effect, instead of set users, we'll dispatch type colon load users. So this is how we dispatch the load users action. We don't have any payload in this load users action. So this is going to be simply an object with type. And to the set is loading, we will be dispatching type colon. What is our action? It is loading. So type is loading. And whether to set this with true or false, we are sending a payload. So I'll say payload colon false. So once the data is loaded, we don't want the loader to be displayed. So we'll send false here. Then coming to add user, once we read the input value, we'll dispatch the add user event. Dispatch type is add user. Let me copy it from here. And what is the payload? Payload is the new user. So payload is new user. Do we have any other payload here? It's just the new user that we are accessing from the payload. Then once the action is displayed, once the user is added to the users, we are just clearing the input and the focus still remains on the same input so that we can add a new user without explicitly clicking on that input box again. Coming to on admin check change, we are collecting the information on whether the checkbox is checked or not based on this event. Then we'll pass this information to the toggle admin event. So dispatch, the type of event is toggle admin. Let me copy it from here. And the payload is going to be the checked information and also the ID, right? Well, let's assume that we are sending an object here in the payload. This object will contain ID, which is nothing but the same ID that we are passing here, and the checked information, checked colon checked. Since both the name and value are same, we can simply say ID comma checked. This is the shorthand notation. Coming to this event, instead of payload, it's payload.id, the checked information. So const checked equals action.payload.checked. You can either access action.payload or you can use the shorthand notation here. I can simply say id comma checked equals action.payload. Now I'll remove these two. So from the action.payload, ID will be assigned to ID, checked will be assigned to checked. Now we have all the actions, the reducer function defined. We have the initial state, we have reducer function with different types of actions. We have dispatched all the actions with the appropriate types and also the payload. Let's save the changes, go back to UI. Now we have an error. Okay. So previously we had direct variables here, users and is loading. That's why we were able to directly access these state variables. But now this information will be present in state. So instead of just is loading, we have to use state.isLoading. Then we have users here. This is state.users, state.users.map. Let's save these changes, go back to UI. Now we have the users. Let me just refresh and see if there are any errors in the console. We don't have any errors in the console. So I will check this. Okay, now we have the error. Go to console. Object is not iterable, cannot use the property symbol. Okay, where do we have this? Okay, so the mistake here is this action.payload is an object, but I used it as an array. In case you want to extract the values from an array, you use the array symbol here. If it's an object, you will just put the braces. Let me just update this. Let me go back to the UI, just reload. We don't have any errors in the console. Now I'll click on this checkbox. Then the user is considered as admin. Then we'll use user space for add user. The user is added to the list of users. In case you want to debug or if you want to see if this action is properly triggered or not, let's put the debug point here in the reducer. For example, in the add user, I'll put a debug point. I'll add another user, user 5, click on add user. In the add user, in this method, we dispatched type add underscore user. So this is the user where the debug is currently on. So in the action payload, we have sent the value that we entered in the input. So action.payload is user 5. There is a value for this payload, so it did not go to this if block. Then we are looping through the state.users. So here we have 4 different users. Actually, we need to add isadmin also. Let's do it in a minute. So it has found the maximum ID, which is 4. Then it is checking if the user is already present in this users list or not. The index is -1, that means the user is not present. So now it will create a new array with the new user, name user 5. And finally, the state will be updated with the new user list. Let me just continue. We have the new user added. Just one small change here. Instead of just name colon user, let's add another property is admin. Initially, this will be set to false when the new user is created. Let me just refresh and add the user, or let me say test user. Click on add. Let me just continue the debug. Now if I add another user, test user 2, click on add. Let's see what the state has. State has 4 users. Now this the newly added user, which is test user, has isadmin false. Though we had to write more code to create this reducer function, this would make the state management much easier as the application grows. You can move this code to a separate file and import it here if you have more logic. Also, if you want to debug the code, you can simply add a console log to this reducer function so that you know where the error occurred. In case of use state, it would be difficult to debug. So this is all about use reducer. Whether to use useState or useReducer is up to your preference. If you feel that you are more comfortable with useState, you can always choose useState. I would recommend using useReducer in case of complex state updates. I hope the concept is clear. If you like the content, please like, share and subscribe to InterviewPro. Thank you.